He stood before the richest man in Ohio with empty pockets. When the father sneered, asking how a simple soldier planned to support his daughter, William Henry Harrison didn't flinch. He placed his hand on the hilt of his sword and declared, "This is my inheritance." He chose honor over gold and won the girl. That frontier courage carried him all the way to the White House. But the hero who survived 1,000 battles couldn't stop the invisible killer in Washington. He fought for decades to lead the nation, only to vanish in 31 days. The year was 1795. The setting was the raw and untamed edge of the American frontier, a place where the forests were dark, the rivers were unmapped, and civilization was a fragile concept held together by gunpowder and grit. In the bustling settlement of Lexington in Kentucky, a young woman named Anna Toothill Simms was the talk of the town. She was 20 years old, and she was a rarity in this rough country. While most women of the territory were hardened by the brutal labor of survival, Anna was a creature of refinement. She had been educated at the prestigious Isabella Graham's Academy in New York City. She spoke with the Polish of the East Coast elite. She read literature, and she possessed a grace that seemed out of place among the log cabins and muddy streets. But her most defining feature wasn't her beauty or her education, it was her father. Anna was the daughter of Judge John Cleves Simms. To call Judge Simms a wealthy man would be a drastic understatement. He was a frontier baron, a colossus of the West. He had orchestrated the purchase of over 300,000 acres of land between the Great Miami and Little Miami rivers, an empire known as the Simms Purchase. He didn't just own land, he owned the future. He was the lawgiver, the landlord, and the undisputed king of the Miami Valley. He was a man who measured a man's worth by the weight of his purse and the expanse of his deeds, and he had very specific, very ambitious plans for his daughter. Into this world of calculated alliances and land speculation walked William Henry Harrison. At 22 years old, Harrison was a captain in the Legion of the United States, serving under the legendary General Mad Anthony Wayne. He was undeniably dashing, with a sharp jawline and the intense gaze of a man who had seen combat. He carried a name that echoed with the thunder of the Revolution. His father was Benjamin Harrison V, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a 3-time governor of Virginia. By all rights, William should have been American royalty. But in the harsh light of 1795, a famous last name couldn't buy a loaf of bread. The Harrison family fortune had evaporated with the death of his father 4 years earlier. William had inherited the pedigree, the pride, and the political connections, but he had not inherited the money. He was land rich in theory, perhaps, but in reality he was a soldier living on a meager army salary. He had a horse, a uniform, a sword, and absolutely nothing else. When William met Anna in Lexington while she was visiting her sister, the attraction was instantaneous. It was the classic collision of opposites, the rugged soldier and the sheltered heiress. They began a courtship that set the local gossips whispering. They met at social gatherings, stole moments of conversation, and fell deeply in love. It was a romance that felt written in the stars. But when the news reached Judge Simms, the reaction was not one of joy, it was one of volcanic contempt. The judge harbored a deep-seated prejudice against the military. To his eyes, soldiers were little more than transients, drifters with guns, men who drank too much, gambled too much, and died too young. He looked at William Henry Harrison, and he didn't see the son of a founding father. He saw a financial liability. He saw a man who would drag his precious educated daughter from one rat-infested fort to another, exposing her to the dangers of the Indian wars and the privations of camp life. The confrontation was inevitable. William, summoning the courage of a man who had charged into battle, approached the judge to ask for Anna's hand. He stood tall in his uniform, respectful but firm, expecting that his family name might carry some weight. Judge Sims didn't even pretend to be polite. He looked the young captain up and down with the sneering arrogance of a man who could buy and sell the entire regiment. He didn't ask about William's love for Anna. He didn't ask about his character. He asked only one question, the question of a businessman. How do you intend to support her? It was a brutal interrogation. The judge pointed out William's lack of property, his dangerous profession, and his empty pockets. He made it clear that a captain's pay was barely enough to keep a horse alive, let alone a lady of Anna's standing. It was a humiliation designed to crush the young soldier's spirit, to remind him of his place in the pecking order. The judge issued a decree. There would be no marriage. He forbade the union and ordered Anna to stop seeing the captain immediately. He believed the matter was settled. After all, in the Sims Empire, the judge's word was law. But he had made a critical error. He underestimated the stubbornness of his own daughter, and he severely underestimated the fighting spirit of William Henry Harrison. The young captain walked away from that meeting with his pride wounded, but his resolve hardened. He had faced British muskets and native tomahawks. He wasn't about to be defeated by a grumpy millionaire with a ledger book. The war for Anna Sims had just begun. Judge Sims made a calculation. He assumed that by forbidding the marriage, he had ended the matter. He was a man used to being obeyed, a man whose signature on a deed could move borders, and whose frown could silence a courtroom. He believed that his daughter Anna was a dutiful child who would weep into her pillow for a week and then move on to a more suitable match. And he believed that Captain Harrison was just another penniless soldier who would march away when dismissed. He was wrong on both counts. He had forgotten that Anna was his daughter. She possessed the same iron will and stubborn streak that had made the judge a millionaire. And he had forgotten that William Henry Harrison was a tactician, a man trained by Mad Anthony Wayne to find weaknesses in an enemy's fortification and exploit them. The judge had laid down a siege, so the captain planned a breakout. The opportunity arrived in late November of 1795. Judge Sims had business in Cincinnati, a full day's ride away from his home in North Bend. As soon as the judge's carriage disappeared down the muddy road, the operation began. This was not a whimsical elopement. It was executed with military precision. On the morning of November 25, 1795, William Henry Harrison rode to the house of Dr. Stephen Wood, the local justice of the peace. Now, Dr. Wood was in a terrible position. He was a friend of Harrison, but he was also a tenant of Judge Sims. He knew that marrying the judge's daughter without permission was a good way to find himself homeless. But Harrison was persuasive. He looked the nervous justice of the peace in the eye and assured him that the judge's anger would fade, but true love would not. Anna arrived shortly after. She had slipped away from her father's estate, trading her silks for a sturdy traveling dress. She knew that the moment she said, "I do," she was effectively disowning herself. She was trading a life of guaranteed luxury for the uncertain existence of an army wife. They didn't wait. There were no flowers, no choir, no guests of honor, just the scratching of a quill on a marriage license and two voices making a promise in a drafty frontier parlor. It was quick, it was quiet, and it was irrevocable. By the time the ink was dry, they were man and wife. But the most telling part of this story isn't the wedding, it's the honeymoon. In a romance novel, the couple would ride off into the sunset to a cozy cottage. But this was the American frontier in the 1790s. There were no cottages, there was only duty. Harrison was still an active duty officer. He couldn't whisk Anna away to Europe. He had to report back to his post. So, for her honeymoon, the heiress of the Miami Valley moved into Fort Washington. Imagine the shock to her system. Anna had grown up in the finest boarding schools of the East. Now her home was a log blockhouse surrounded by a stockade wall. Her lullaby was the sound of sentries shouting passwords and the distant howling of wolves. The air smelled of gunpowder, unwashed wool, and wood smoke. The mud was ankle deep, and the threat of attack was constant. This is where the frontier baron's daughter proved her mettle. She didn't complain. She didn't pack her bags and run back to daddy. She learned to cook over an open fire. She learned to mend uniforms, and she learned to sleep with a loaded pistol nearby. She embraced the hardship because she believed in the man she had married. She saw something in William that her father had missed. She saw a future president, even if he was currently sleeping on a cot. Meanwhile, Judge Simmies returned to North Bend. When he discovered what had happened, the explosion was legendary. He felt betrayed by his friend Dr. Wood, betrayed by his daughter, and outmaneuvered by the penniless captain. For weeks he refused to speak to them. The silence from the Simmies estate was deafening. He told anyone who would listen that Anna had thrown her life away on a beggar with a sword. But here is the beauty of the American spirit. It respects boldness. Even the grumpy judge couldn't maintain his rage forever against a fait accompli. 2 weeks after the wedding, the judge finally agreed to a dinner with the couple. It was a tense affair. The air was thick enough to cut with a knife. At the end of the meal, the judge turned to William, his eyes narrowing, and he finally asked the question that had been burning in his chest, the question that defined the class struggle of the young nation. "Well, sir," the judge grumbled, "I understand you have married Anna, but how do you intend to support her?" The room went quiet. This was the moment of truth. Harrison didn't look at his shoes. He didn't apologize, and he didn't beg for a dowry. He stood up. He rested his hand on the hilt of his service saber, the same sword he had carried into the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and he delivered the line that would become part of American folklore. "By this sword, sir," Harrison replied, "and my own right arm." It was a declaration of independence. He was telling the millionaire that he didn't need his land, he didn't need his money, and he didn't need his permission. He had his honor, he had his strength, and in America, that was supposed to be enough. The judge stared at him, perhaps for the first time, seeing the steel in his son-in-law's spine. He didn't smile, but he poured a drink. "We shall see," the judge muttered. "We shall see." It was an uneasy truce, but William Henry Harrison had won the first battle. He had secured his flank, he had captured the prize, and he had proven that in the land of the free, a man's destiny is not written by his father-in-law. It is written by his own daring. The couple returned to the fort, united against the world, ready to face a future that would take them to glory and eventually to tragedy. 2 weeks. That was how long the silence lasted. 2 weeks of William Henry Harrison living in a drafty blockhouse at Fort Washington, sleeping on a cot, while his new bride tried to make a home out of rough timber and military rations. They were happy, yes, but the shadow of North Bend loomed over them. Judge Sims was not a man who faded away. He was a force of nature. And eventually, the summons came. It wasn't an apology. It was a demand. The judge wanted to see the man who had stolen his daughter. On a cold December evening in 1795, William and Anna rode back to the great estate, the big house of the Miami Valley. Imagine the scene. The house was warm, lit by expensive beeswax candles. The table was set with imported china and silver. Everything in that room screamed wealth. Everything screamed power. And sitting at the head of the table was John Cleve Sims, the Emperor of the West. He didn't rise to greet them. He simply watched them enter, his eyes cold, calculating like a banker assessing a bad loan. The dinner was an exercise in psychological warfare. The only sounds were the scraping of silverware and the crackling of the fire. The judge ignored William completely, directing small talk only to his daughter. It was a deliberate snub, a way of saying, "You are invisible to me. You are nothing." But Harrison sat straight. He was an officer of the Legion. He had been trained by General Wayne to hold his composure under fire. And make no mistake, this dinner table was a battlefield. He ate his meal, he sipped his wine, and he waited. He knew the attack was coming. Finally, as the plates were cleared, the judge turned his heavy gaze upon the young captain. The silence stretched out, heavy, suffocating. The judge didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply leaned back in his chair, swirled his wine glass, and delivered the insult with a smile. "Well, sir," the judge said, his voice dripping with false politeness, "I understand you have married Anna." He paused, letting the weight of the statement hang in the air. "But I must ask, given your situation, how do you intend to support her?" It was a trap. If Harrison talked about his salary, he would look pathetic. A captain's pay was a pittance compared to the Sims' fortune. If he talked about his family name, he would look like a snob living on past glories. The judge expected him to stutter, to apologize, to beg for a job or a loan. He wanted to break the young soldier in front of his daughter to prove that love couldn't pay the rent. But William Henry Harrison did not stutter. He stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. He was 22 years old. He had no land. He had no money. He had no inheritance. But he was wearing the uniform of the United States Army, and at his hip hung his service saber. In the 18th century, a sword was not just a piece of metal. It was the soul of an officer. It represented his honor, his courage, and his willingness to bleed for what he believed in. Harrison looked the millionaire in the eye. He didn't look down. He didn't look at Anna for help. He placed his hand firmly on the hilt of his weapon. The leather creaked. The brass fittings glinted in the candlelight. It was a gesture of defiance that would have gotten a lesser man thrown out of the house. "By this sword, sir," Harrison declared, his voice steady, ringing off the walls of the rich man's dining room, "and my own right arm." The room went deadly silent. It was the perfect answer. It was the only answer. With 8 words, Harrison stripped away the pretensions of wealth and class. He was telling the judge, "You have gold, but I have steel. You have land, but I have the strength to take it, to defend it, and to carve a life out of this wilderness." It was the ultimate American statement. In the old world, status was determined by who your father was. In the new world, in the America that Harrison was fighting to build, status was determined by what you could do, by the strength of your arm and the fire in your gut. Judge Sims stared at him. The sneer faded from his lips. For a long moment, the two men locked eyes, the Baron and the soldier, the past and the future, and then the judge began to chuckle. It wasn't a warm laugh, it was the dry, grudging laugh of a man who recognizes a worthy adversary. He poured himself another glass of wine. "We shall see," he muttered, raising his glass in a mock toast. "We shall see." It wasn't a blessing, but it was a surrender. The judge knew he had lost. He couldn't buy this man. He couldn't scare him, and he couldn't break him. Harrison had passed the test. He had walked into the lion's den with nothing but his honor, and he had walked out with his pride intact. This moment defined William Henry Harrison for the rest of his life. Decades later, when he ran for president, they would call him Old Tippecanoe, the hero of the frontier. But the legend didn't start on a battlefield against the British or the Tecumseh Confederacy. It started in a dining room in North Bend, when a penniless boy told a millionaire that a sword and a strong arm were the only inheritance a free man needed. He proved that night that he was worthy of Anna. And more importantly, he proved he was worthy of his own destiny. It is a beautiful story. The penniless soldier standing on his honor, defying the millionaire with nothing but a sword. It stirs the blood. It fits perfectly into the American myth of the self-made man. But history is rarely as simple as a fairy tale, and William Henry Harrison was not just a romantic hero. He was a Harrison, and Harrisons are bred for power. The truth is, you cannot eat honor, and a sword does not keep the rain off your children's heads. Harrison knew this. He understood that in the early American Republic there was only one true currency: land. So not long after that dramatic dinner, the sword went back into its scabbard. Harrison resigned his commission in the Army in 1798. He traded his uniform for a politician's frock coat. And here is where the irony deepens. Judge Sims may have grumbled about the marriage, but the Sims name opened doors that would have remained locked to a simple captain. Harrison didn't just walk away from his father-in-law. He stepped right into the vacuum of power that men like Sims had created. He was appointed Secretary of the Northwest Territory. It was a boring title with immense power. Suddenly, the man who had been lectured about money was the man deciding who owned the land. He was the gatekeeper of the frontier, and he didn't waste time. By 1800, Harrison wasn't living in a drafty fort anymore. He was the governor of the Indiana Territory, and he needed a home that reflected his new status. He didn't build a log cabin. He didn't build a modest farmhouse. He built Grouseland. Located in Vincennes, Grouseland was the first brick home in the entire territory. It was a fortress of civilization in the wilderness. It had walnut woodwork, imported glass, grand fireplaces, and a central hallway large enough to host a ball. It was a statement. It shouted to every settler, native chief, and rival politician that the Harrisons were not just surviving the frontier, they were ruling it. For Anna, this was the fulfillment of the promise. She wasn't scrubbing floors in a shack. She was the first lady of the territory, presiding over dinners that rivaled anything back east. She raised their growing brood of children, 10 in total, in a setting of comfort and security. This is the fascinating contradiction of William Henry Harrison. He would later run for president as the log cabin candidate, the simple man of the people who drank hard cider and lived in a hut. But the reality was Grouseland. The reality was thousands of acres of land speculation. The reality was that the penniless soldier had become a landed aristocrat, just like his father and just like his father-in-law. So when he told Judge Sims that he would support Anna with this sword and my own right arm, he wasn't lying. But he wasn't just talking about combat. He was talking about the ruthlessness required to conquer a continent. He used his sword to clear the land and his arm to sign the treaties that took it. The romance of 1795 had evolved into the empire of the 1800s. He had proven the judge wrong, not by rejecting his world, but by beating him at his own game. He had become the very thing the judge respected most, a baron of the West. But while Grouseland was a monument to Harrison's success, it was also a fortress of secrets. We look at the portraits of William and Anna, the frontier power couple raising their 10 children in the lap of luxury. It looks like the perfect American family. But if you peel back the wallpaper, if you listen to the whispers that have echoed through the African American community for nearly 2 centuries, you find a story so dark, so monstrous, that it threatens to shatter the Harrison legend completely. There was another woman at Grouseland. Her name was Dilcia. She was not a guest. She was not a mistress in the European sense. She was enslaved. She was the property of William Henry Harrison. To the outside world, she was a servant, a shadow moving through the hallways with a tray of tea. But to Harrison, she was something else entirely. According to the oral history passed down through generations of her descendants, Harrison maintained a sexual relationship with Dilcia for years, right under the nose of his wife Anna. And this was not a barren affair. Dilcia gave birth to 6 children, children who carried the blood of a founding father's son, children who shared the same DNA as the legitimate heirs playing in the nursery upstairs. But these children were born into chains. Now, adultery in the 19th century was common. Many powerful men had shadow families. Thomas Jefferson is the most famous example. But usually there was a code, a twisted, hypocritical code of Southern gentlemen. You kept them quiet, you kept them on the plantation, and often upon your death, you freed them because deep down you knew they were your own flesh and blood. But William Henry Harrison was not Thomas Jefferson. He was a man consumed by ambition. By 1840, he was looking at the White House. The Whig Party was packaging him as a moral hero, the log cabin candidate, a man of simple virtue, a mixed-race family, a brood of enslaved children who looked suspiciously like the candidate, was not just a scandal. It was a political nuclear bomb. It could destroy his campaign before it even started. So Harrison had to make a choice between his humanity and his ambition, between his children and his presidency. And this is where the story turns into a horror movie. According to the historical allegations, Harrison didn't just hide his children. He didn't just ignore them. He liquidated them. To clean up his image for the national stage, he allegedly made the decision to sell 4 of his own biological children. Let that sink in. Imagine the scene. A man who claims to be a hero, a leader of men, looking at the faces of 4 children, faces that likely mirrored his own eyes, his own jawline, and seeing them not as sons and daughters, but as incriminating evidence that needed to be disposed of. He didn't send them to school. He didn't set them free. He reportedly sold them into the Deep South, down the river. It was a death sentence. to be sold from the relative comfort of a household in Indiana or Ohio to the brutal cotton fields of Georgia or Mississippi was the ultimate nightmare for an enslaved person, and it was inflicted upon them by their own father. He kept Dilsia, perhaps because he couldn't bear to lose her, or perhaps to keep her silent, and he kept 2 of the children. But the other 4 were gone, erased from the ledger, converted from family into cash. It is an act of cold-blooded pragmatism that chills the blood. It reveals the terrifying rot at the core of the era's politics, that a man could stand on a podium and talk about liberty, talk about the American spirit, while the receipts for the sale of his own children were still fresh in his pocket. This story was suppressed for over a century. The history books wanted to protect the image of the hero of Tippecanoe. They didn't want to talk about Dilsia, but the truth has a way of surviving. One of the children he kept, a daughter named Marie, would eventually have a son named Walter White, who would go on to become one of the most important civil rights leaders in American history, serving as the head of the NAACP. Walter White knew who his grandfather was. He knew the cost of his existence. He carried the secret of the Harrison bloodline not as a badge of honor, but as a testament to the brutality of the American system. So when you see the statues of William Henry Harrison, when you hear about his frontier honor and his sword and right arm, remember Dilsia. Remember the 4 children who vanished into the cotton fields. Harrison proved that he would do anything to become president. He would sacrifice his comfort, he would sacrifice his health, and ultimately, he would sacrifice his own soul. He secured the White House, but the price was paid by the innocent, and that stain is something that no amount of rain on Inauguration Day could ever wash away. While history focuses on the secrets hidden in the shadows of Grouseland, we must not forget the light that burned in the center of the house, a light that flickered, dimmed, but never went out for 45 years. Anna Sims Harrison. We often paint the wives of great men as 2-dimensional figures. They are the faithful companions, the hostesses, the women who smile in the background of oil paintings. But the life of Anna Harrison was not a painting. It was a war of attrition. When she eloped with William in 1795, she was a delicate girl educated in the finest schools of New York. She read Shakespeare and discussed philosophy. But the moment she crossed the threshold into the frontier, she was drafted into a struggle that was far more dangerous than any battle her husband ever fought, the struggle of motherhood in the 19th century. Between 1796 and 1814, Anna gave birth 10 times, 10 children in 18 years. Let that reality settle in. For nearly 2 decades, her body was either carrying a child or nursing one. In an era before antibiotics, before modern medicine, before anesthesia, every pregnancy was a roll of the dice with death. And she did this while living on the edge of the wilderness, often with her husband miles away fighting the British or the Tecumseh Confederacy. William Henry Harrison is remembered as the hero of Tippecanoe. But while he was out winning glory on the battlefield, Anna was fighting the silent battles of the home front. She was the one who managed the massive Grouseland estate when William was away in Washington. She was the one who educated the children when there were no schools. She was the doctor, the accountant, and the spiritual anchor of the family. And the cost was catastrophic. By her 40s, Anna's health was shattered. The constant strain of childbirth left her frail, often confined to her bed for weeks at a time. She suffered from chronic illness, a physical exhaustion that seeped into her bones. The vibrant, rebellious girl who had stood up to her millionaire father was replaced by a woman worn thin by duty. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional weight she carried. The frontier was a cruel place for children, and the Harrison family was not spared. Of her 10 children, she would have to bury 9 of them. It is a level of grief that is almost impossible for us to comprehend today. She watched her firstborn daughter Betsy die at 29. She watched her son Simmys die at 30. She watched her son William Jr. succumb to alcoholism and ruin. One by one, the lights she had brought into the world were extinguished. She stood by the graves in the North Bend Cemetery, weeping into the fresh earth, and then she had to dry her eyes, straighten her back, and go back to supporting the great man. This is the definition of the American pioneer woman. We glorify the men who cleared the forests with axes, but it was women like Anna who filled those clearings with civilization. She absorbed the pain. She absorbed the loneliness of the long winters. She absorbed the rumors of her husband's infidelity, and she transmuted it all into stability. She was the soft landing for William's ambition. When he lost elections, she was there. When he was drowning in debt, which was often because for all his land grabbing, Harrison was terrible with money, she was there. She was the only constant in a life defined by chaos. So when you look at William Henry Harrison, the general, the governor, the president, we are looking at a man standing on a foundation built by his wife's sacrifice. She gave him her youth, she gave him her health, and she gave him a legacy. She paid for his glory with her own life force. And in the history of the American West, that is a heroism that deserves more than just a footnote. It deserves a monument. The year the sword and right arm finally conquered the ultimate prize, William Henry Harrison won the presidency in a landslide. The log cabin campaign had worked. The American people had fallen in love with the image of the rugged frontiersman, the hero who drank hard cider and lived simply. It was the vindication of a lifetime of struggle. He had proven Judge Sims wrong. He had proven his doubters wrong. He was the most powerful man in the Western Hemisphere. But as he prepared to leave for Washington, the partner who had made it all possible was not by his side. Anna was 65 years old. Her body was wrecked by illness and the toll of burying 9 children. She was too frail to make the grueling winter journey over the mountains. So they made a plan. William would go ahead to secure the White House, and Anna would follow in the spring when the flowers bloomed and the roads cleared. She kissed him goodbye at the door of the Grouseland estate. She told him, "I will see you in May." She never saw him again. On March 4th, 1841, William Henry Harrison stood on the steps of the Capitol. It was a freezing wet day. The wind was biting. But Harrison refused to wear an overcoat. He refused to wear a hat. He wanted to show the world that old Tippecanoe was still tough, that he was still the soldier who had slept in the mud. He delivered the longest inaugural address in history, talking for nearly 2 hours in the driving rain. It was an act of vanity, an act of defiance against his own age, and it was his death warrant. The cold settled into his lungs. Pneumonia set in. Or perhaps it was the tainted water of the White House. The doctors came with their leeches and their opium, but the old soldier was fading. On April 4th, 1841, just 31 days after taking the oath, William Henry Harrison died. He was the first president to die in office. the shortest term in American history. Now, shift the camera back to North Bend, Ohio. Anna Simmons Harrison was packing her trunks. She was choosing her dresses, planning the dinners she would host. She was ready to finally take her place as the First Lady, to enjoy the reward for 45 years of sacrifice. Then a rider appeared on the road. He carried a letter with a black seal. She didn't faint. She didn't scream. She simply accepted the crushing reality. She was the First Lady who never entered the White House. She was a widow before she had even finished packing. The nation was in shock. Congress didn't know what to do. There was no precedent for a president leaving a wife behind in poverty. So, in a rare act of conscience, they voted to give Anna a pension. They awarded her $25,000, the equivalent of 1 year of the president's salary. It was a fortune at the time. Judge Sims would have been impressed. William had finally supported her in the grandest way possible. But the check was signed with his blood. Anna Harrison lived for another 23 years. She outlived the Whig Party. She lived to see her grandson, Benjamin Harrison, become a general in the Civil War, a war that tore apart the very Union her husband had led. She lived quietly in North Bend, a ghost of a bygone era, the woman who had seen the frontier turn into cities. In the end, the story of William and Anna is a tragedy of timing. He spent his entire life fighting for the summit. He fought the British. He fought the natives. He fought his father-in-law. He fought his own debts. And when he finally reached the top of the mountain, he found that the air was too thin to breathe. He had told the judge that his sword was his inheritance, and he was right. That sword carved an empire. It won him the girl. It won him the presidency. But swords are made for war, not for happiness. The ambition that drove him to the White House was the same force that left his wife alone in an empty room, holding a black-sealed letter, realizing that the American dream often demands the ultimate payment, not in gold, but in time. And time was the one thing William Henry Harrison had run out of. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to my channel, like and share to support me. See you in the next video. Have a good day.